is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
To ban or not to ban? East Africa's second-hand clothes debate is back in the spotlight. In 2016, 4 countries in the region agreed to phase out second-hand clothing imports by 2019. However, their recent efforts to restrict imports have triggered heated responses from the US, with the latter threatening to suspend their AGOA benefits, citing tens of thousands of job losses. Despite the threat, Rwanda has proceeded with the restrictions on importing second-hand clothes, even as Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania back out on the agreement. So are these countries ready to provide an alternative solution to second-hand clothing imports? And how will their different stances affect their local textile manufacturing industries? I'm Lindy Mtongana. Welcome to Talk Africa. The second-hand clothes market is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In the East African region, proposals to phase out the business, popularly known as mitumba, are being met with mixed reactions. While proponents believe the move will have a long-term positive impact on the local textile industry, skeptics remain apprehensive about the fate of the tens of thousands benefiting from the mitumba trade. So how do the two situations compare? Let's take a look. Scores of narrow, winding paths culminate in a maze of stalls, selling every conceivable item of clothing at Nairobi's Gikomba market. It's one of the biggest and busiest second-hand markets in East Africa, with tens of thousands of buyers and sellers trading here every day. Gikomba has served Kenyans with affordable, fashionable goods for over 40 years and provided jobs, not only to the traders here, but to thousands employed in the value chain across the country, all of whom would be affected by recurrent proposed restrictions on the second-hand trade. A move East African countries hope will revive local textile manufacturing in the region. But for traders like Ephantus Kimani, it's a move that many do not support.
From this business, I have been able to build a home and school my children. I have also employed people. At this stand alone, I have 2 employees and I am able to pay them. If I ever left this business, life would get very difficult.
Customers agree.
I think if they ban second-hand clothes, it really make us feel bad because we're used to this. They're very cheap and they're very affordable.
I would advise the government to first do more research before imposing a ban, because in my view, the business does no harm.
Thousands of miles away, there's another key player who's feeling anxious. The United States fears that tens of thousands of American jobs could be lost should East Africa impose barriers on used clothes from the US. President Donald Trump has hit back with threats to suspend the duty-free treatment of clothing from Africa under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA. This has been enough to make Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania reconsider their stance. But Rwanda is not backing down. Over the past 3 years, the government has raised tariffs on used clothing imports from 20 US cents to $2.50 per kilogram. Authorities say this is a crucial step towards developing a sustainable homegrown textile industry. And aspiring entrepreneurs are rising to the challenge.
We are in Ufako's and Vlisco's factory. We are focused on textile industry. We have more than 100 youth. They are trainees and technicians. We started our business since this year. It's a Rwandan business. The shareholders are Rwandan, and we want to promote made in Rwanda.
In the second-hand markets of Kigali, however, traders are a little less optimistic about the changes.
After reducing imports of second-hand clothes, some of us are losing jobs. We have less clothes in the market and the prices are high. For example, I was selling this at $6, now it's $10. It's too difficult for customers who are used to buying cheap clothes. It's affecting everyone.
While the likes of Kenya continue to mull their options, Rwanda is pushing on ahead with phasing out second-hand clothing, confident that today's hardships are only temporary and that for investors, market traders and consumers, there is far more to be gained in the long term. Kigali remains the only capital in the East African region to have firmly demonstrated its resolve to promote a stronger local textile industry in the midst of the ongoing tussle over second-hand clothes imports. I spoke to the Acting Director General of Rwanda's Ministry of Trade and Industry, Mr. Telesphore Mugwiza. He expounded on the government's agenda to boost domestic manufacturing and exports through the Made in Rwanda initiative. Let's listen in. Mr. Mugwiza, to begin with, I was hoping you could explain to us, if you could, just what exactly is the Made in Rwanda initiative or project, and why is it such an important agenda for the Rwandan government at this stage?
Made in Rwanda initiative came from a study we conducted, the study called Domestic Market Recapturing Strategy. This study was conducted to identify key sectors where we need to put more efforts. After identifying that Rwanda is experiencing a trade deficit, so to know exactly where we need to put more efforts, we conducted that study, which was done in 2015. And that study gave different recommendations. One of those recommendations was promotion of locally made product, what we call Made in Rwanda.
And you said this started with identifying key sectors. What are the key sectors and industries that fall under Made in Rwanda?
There are three main sectors identified. The one is construction materials, the second one is light manufacturing, and the third one is agro-processing. By doing analysis of those sectors, the study indicated that if we manage to implement the recommendations from that study, Rwanda may save $450 every year. That is the money that we spend for importation of different products that we can make locally.
And so just to narrow our focus towards the textile industry, I'm assuming that falls under light manufacturing?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Can you explain why clothing is a part of the Made in Rwanda brand or the Made in Rwanda initiative?
Textile is one of Made in Rwanda product because, you know, textile is a product that we can make locally easily. Even if we import raw materials, we can make different products, different textile products here in Rwanda. Even people who did not attend school, they can be trained and then they can make clothes. So this is a really important product because it can be done by different people. It doesn't require much skills. It can even be done at low level. If you train, people can do that.
And up until now, many people in East Africa have been getting their clothes from second-hand markets, used clothing coming in from various parts of the world. And in order to make the Made in Rwanda textile manufacturing a success, it seems that Rwanda has decided to restrict the imports of second-hand clothing. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, you know, when you want to promote local textile industry, you need to promote them by reducing the importation of second-hand clothes. That is that we did to promote local industry. By reducing the importation of used clothes, you promote local industries. You mean you open the market for local industries because they can get the market. But if you do not do that, you cannot promote your local industries, your local textile industry.
And can the local industry at this point meet the demand for clothing, for new clothing then, let's say?
In fact, we're still importing second-hand clothes. Now the importation of used clothes and shoes has reduced up to 90%. We're still importing 10%. But we realized that by doing this, there is really a big investment in textile industry in Rwanda. There are new investors coming in. As we are facilitating new investors to invest in textile industry, we have realized that many investors are coming in, and even as individual tailors are being organized to be able to increase production in terms of quantity, in terms of quality. So there are different designs, and we realize that the different products that we used to import, they are being produced locally.
So how do you balance the risks and the benefits here? Because some people might look at the restriction on imports as having a negative impact on consumers, saying that they're the ones that are going to pay the price, that this is a tax on the poor, a negative impact on traders who may very well lose their jobs, and a negative impact possibly on government who may get less taxes if the second-hand market industry basically is shut down. But on the other end, you're suggesting that there's still much to be gained and that there's many benefits coming from the Made in Rwanda brand.
I see the advantages are more than disadvantages, as I mentioned, because by promoting locally made products in the sector of textile, there will be increasing in terms of even tax. The job will be created. So people may think that people who used to do trading of second-hand clothes may lose their job. Actually, they can do trading of new clothes. Actually, there is a good initiative to link local factories and traders who used to trade used clothes. So they will not lose their job. They change. What they do is just to change, to shift from used clothes to the new ones.
And what about consumers? This criticism that this is a tax on the poor. Aren't the new clothes going to be a little bit more expensive than what they could afford at the second-hand clothing markets?
No, that is not true, because the producers of textile product, they need to have different categories of clothes according to different categories of people. They are producing different categories, different price, from the lowest to the highest, and the people may do their own choice depending on their capacity.
And how will you protect the local industry from cheap new clothes from foreign countries?
Actually, the government is supporting local industries. For example, the government has approved the VAT exemption to the raw materials, to the fabrics, and to the capital goods. When they import machines, they are VAT exempted, and even for fabrics that they are importing, it is VAT exempted. The government has approved provision of serviced land in Kigali Special Economic Zone. We have 5 hectares reserved only for textile and leather product. So when you want to invest in textile industry, you can get land. You are facilitated to pay in a given period of time, 5 years, 10 years, depending on the negotiation. And then you can get that land, you start your production. As I mentioned, you can also enjoy the exemption or VAT exemption on raw materials and capital goods.
And at the moment, could you give us an idea of the scale of the Made in Rwanda brand when it comes to textiles and clothing, and essentially what your future prospects are?
Actually, we have more than 15, about 15 companies, and others are in the pipeline. They are trying to get land where they can put their factories. Others are still analyzing the market, and we hope that after maybe 2 or 3 years, there will be more than 20.
Thank you so much. We're taking a short break now, and when we come back, we'll be joined by an expert panel of guests to further explore the dilemma of second-hand clothes imports. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. I'm now joined in studio by David Owiro, an independent economic and political affairs analyst based in Nairobi. He's also a former economic analyst at the Institute of Economic Affairs of Kenya. David, thank you so much for joining us in studio. Now, to begin with, for the sake of context, we know that there was a time when Kenya and a number of other East African countries were home to thriving textile manufacturing sectors. Essentially, what happened? What was the key change that shifted everything?
Well, if you remember correctly, this was during the pre-liberalization period. So these economies had typically not opened up, and most of them were actually implementing the infant industry policies, which is basically a protectionist policy that was put in place in order to cushion local or domestic producers and manufacturers in the sector. And so as a result, we had somewhat thriving. I wouldn't say, I would qualify that in the sense that, of course, these were products which were not globally competitive, and in terms of having very large input costs. So the cost of labor, but oftentimes also the cost of capital was very high. And so with the liberalization, of course, you had countries globally that were much more competitive than the typical East African industries. And so, of course, what happened naturally is these farms basically went under.
Yeah. And of course, what the East African community is essentially trying to do is reverse some of the worst aspects of that damage by reviving local industries and, in this sense, restricting imports of second-hand clothing. But many say that there are very important pros and cons that need to be looked at here. And let's do that for now. Let's start with consumers. Some say that by imposing higher tariffs on the imports of second-hand clothing, that this really essentially amounts to nothing more than a tax on the poor. What's your view?
Well, that notion is correct to the extent that these import tariffs, of course, will be passed on to the final consumer. And so the result will be much more expensive second-hand clothes. And so in the short term, of course, we will see a negative in terms of economic value. But at the same time, if you look at the opposing argument, the reason why you want to put a tariff is so that you can, in fact, use some of that revenue to develop your domestic production and domestic manufacturing. And so in the long run, you will have employment opportunities and even rising of incomes. And with that, the temporary or the short-term impact of high consumer prices perhaps will be eroded. You'll have a net gain when you look at it in the long term.
But indeed, over the past few decades, we've seen the second-hand clothing industry provide thousands of jobs across East Africa. So what's your view then as to what happens or the impact on these changes on the traders that work in the markets across East Africa, and indeed also on revenue that East African governments have been earning from second-hand clothing?
Yeah, certainly the growth in the second-hand clothing market has been in the trade services. And so you've got small-scale traders who are basically peddling or hawking their goods in the local towns and markets. And so this has provided, of course, a very huge source of income. But at the same time, the other side of the argument is, the margins are pretty low. And so when you compare the value addition in terms of that would come from a manufacturing or production job versus these very low-skilled trading services jobs, of course, the manufacturing has a higher income level. And so while the impact of this will be, of course, if there's a total ban, then it means these jobs will become almost non-extinct. I think what we should also be wary of is there will be a gap, because indeed these products are bought because consumers feel that there's a value for money, there's a competitive reason to buy them, because of the price points and things like that. And so if you suddenly withdraw this and there's no actually equivalent products within the economy, whether domestically produced or not, then you end up having a big mess, because this gap that consumers will then be faced with.
Well, let's expand this conversation a little further. The proposed plan to restrict imports of second-hand clothing in Africa is not only somewhat unpopular here, but in the United States too. The US, of course, is a key exporter of used clothes and shoes to the East African region. For more on the American perspective, from Philadelphia, we welcome Michael Johns to the conversation. Michael Johns is a policy analyst, co-founder of the Tea Party movement, and a former White House speechwriter for President George Bush. Welcome, Michael. Michael, let's get straight to it. As we understand, America is very much opposed to possible restrictions on U.S. exports of secondhand clothing to East Africa. Just explain America's position for us and what the U.S. stands to lose.
Well, on a macro level, in the 1990s, we obviously launched this, new trade relationship and partnership, AGOA, which is designed to remove tariffs and expand economic freedom in Africa, and also to maintain low tariffs in the United States for the purposes of exports of African products here. And for the most part, this has worked really well. I mean, we've seen, I think, it being a kind of fundamental part of America's Africa policy in the sense that we're transitioning from more of an aid-based relationship, though our aid remains very high, tens of billions of dollars that the U.S. has committed in aid to the African continent since 1960, into more of a trade relationship, which I think is immensely promising for Africa's fairly fast-growing economy and also for the U.S. And, so now we're sort of coming across some glitches in the road in the Rwanda situation, but for the most part, countries are adhering to the policies and practices of AGOA, and it's proving generally beneficial. The U.S. agenda and policy toward Africa continues to be one of seeing Africa prosper, to see it develop, to see it both in a job-creating and economy, but also to see access for U.S. products not be impeded with tariffs, which add to the final cost of those products to consumers, many of whom are, already poor and struggling and, looking for affordable products.
Well, Michael, as you say, there's been many benefits from AGOA seen over the past few years. But indeed, now the U.S. has gone as far as to threaten to suspend benefits under AGOA should EAC countries go ahead and impose barriers that will affect U.S. exports. And in this case, as you mentioned, Rwanda has received a letter threatening that suspension. Can you justify that for us?
Well, yeah, essentially what happened was last year, the association representing the secondary apparel market in the United States filed a petition with the U.S. government listing a number of concerns and complaints about tariffs that they believe to be inconsistent with AGOA's underlying commitments. It was reviewed by the administration. Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya were all considered to be in compliance, and the tariff reductions and policies remain intact there. But when they evaluated Rwanda, there was, in fact, some legitimacy to the petition that was filed. So the administration, I think correctly, is not underreacted or overreacted. They are addressing it. It's a suspension, not a termination. And I think it affords the opportunity for the U.S. and Rwandan governments to have a conversation about the agreement itself, the importance of it, the opportunity to Rwanda for its exports to the United States, and hopefully to resolve it on this singular issue area of concern in secondary clothing.
Well, David, let's bring you in here. As you heard Michael say, this is not an underreaction, not an overreaction. What's your view? Is the U.S. response a fair one?
Well, if you look at the circumstances, I think, as has been stated, the two countries, specifically in this case Rwanda and the US, has been in conversation to try and address this challenge. But so I'm not privy to the context. But if you were to look at a better response or a better way of going about it, it would be important for the US government to understand the context within which Rwanda and even EAC countries were implementing or designing this tariff increase for second-hand clothes. And so in terms of fairness, yes, Rwanda did increase the tariffs by more than 100%. So that is indeed drastic. And so US has some justification to consider this move that they're now considering. But at the same time, we have to remember that one of the tenets of AGOA was basically to provide opportunity for African economies to develop their value chains in these particular sectors of textile and apparel. And so the move by EAC countries to put in place this particular policy was actually to address that value chain problem. And so this ban actually might stand in the way of AGOA's own interest and AGOA's own objective of actually encouraging member countries to develop value chains in the textile and apparel industry.
And Michael, let's just come back to you one last time. There is something else that has been leveled at the United States as something of a criticism of this action. I know earlier you said this is not an overreaction, but used clothing exports from the US to all East African community countries combined had an all-time peak of $43 million, and that was in 2012. This is 0.003% of American exports. So some say it's a truly negligible industry in the United States.
Well, was brought to the attention of the U.S. government through a petition by an association that represents that industry, which in turn employs thousands of Americans throughout the country. And so I think this is a real technical component. It's a subset of a subset of the larger agreement that has generally been working, I think, both for the African continent and its people and for the United States. But when you have a violation of this nature, I mean, for the agreement to have any meaning, it has to be addressed. And so the next logical step is to expand discussions between the Rwandan government and U.S. trade representatives and see if this can be resolved.
All right, David, just a final closing comment from you. What started as a joint commitment from East African countries in 2016 has resulted essentially in Rwanda left alone now to negotiate this particular AGOA position with the United States. What, in your view, should East African countries be doing?
I think the big lesson is that in as much as we tried as African member states or even individual countries, as much as we try to develop economic policies that seek to address the needs and priorities of our nations, we have to bear in mind the impact that that has on trading arrangements that those individual countries have globally. And so perhaps if there was a revision of this, it should have been important for the EAC to cooperate and collaborate with the US as to how they would implement their vision of growing their domestic production and manufacturing in the textiles and apparel sector, so that the US can work hand in hand within the frameworks of AGOA with these countries.
Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much. That's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. Thank you to my guests for your insights. Michael Johns in Philadelphia, a policy analyst and co-founder of the Tea Party movement and a former White House speechwriter. And with me in studio, David Owiro, an independent economic and political affairs analyst. Now, you can keep the conversation going online through our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And remember to tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Lindy Mtongana, it's goodbye.